I understand that you started this series called Around the Table, where we're looking at various conversations that happen around meals with Jesus. Now, the thing about meals is that meals are very personal. They're very intimate, and they're very intentional. We usually share them with the people that we actually want to be around. I mean, think back to our high school days. Lunch wasn't just about food. It was about where you sat and who you sat with. At weddings, what's the first thing we do when we get to that cocktail hour? We check the table list and see who are we sitting next to? Who is going to be with us? Do I know them? Is it going to be fun or is it going to be awkward? Even at something as simple as a work lunch or maybe a casual dinner with friends, we sort of instinctively do the dance where you stand around the table and you see where everyone's going to sit, and we try to get close to that person that we would rather sit next to so that we can go beyond the small talk. Now, most of us, we wouldn't say this out loud, but if we're honest, we like to eat with people that we're comfortable with, people that we like, people that are like us. Sharing a meal can feel like sacred space, and we tend to guard it very carefully. But what happens when that space is interrupted? What if someone totally unlike you, someone who doesn't fit in at all, comes up to your table? And what's the first thought that you have? How do you respond to that kind of intrusion? Well, that's exactly the situation that we find in our story today. And what unfolds in this story is actually one of the most powerful pictures of forgiveness and love that we see in the Bible. Now, we just read through this narrative, but I want to go back to verse 36 of Luke chapter 7. And there it says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. So this story, it opens up with Jesus opening or accepting this invitation to dine at the home of a Pharisee named Simon. Now, in this culture, a meal or a banquet wasn't just a meal, it was a huge event. And you can almost picture the table carefully arranged and just brimming with abundance. There would be soft, warm flatbread, crispy on the edges, pillowy in the middle, delicious all by itself, but even better if you dip that in olive oil and vinegar and just a pinch of salt. You'd find dishes filled with lentils and chickpeas, cool slices of cucumber, and of course, cured olives, salty and rich and just packed with flavor. There might even be a first century version of a charcuterie board. Sweet sticky dates, juicy figs and grapes and pomegranate seeds, crunchy almonds and pistachios and walnuts, creamy goat cheese and tangy yogurt-like drinks. And since this dinner likely took place in the region of Galilee, you'd probably find some fresh fish from the Sea of Galilee on the table, maybe grilled, maybe dried and salted. Meat was considered a luxury, but at a banquet like this, you'd probably be treated to some slow-roasted lamb or some crispy poultry. And of course, all of this would be washed down with a lightly sweetened wine. Nothing like our modern wines that we would drink today, but something deeply rooted in the local harvests and season. I mean, it would have been quite the table spread. And Luke frames this scene in a way that's reminiscent of what's called a Greco-Roman symposium. It's a formal dinner that's followed by a meaningful conversation or a debate. See, it wasn't just about the food, it was about the gathering, it was about the ideas and the people that were present. Now, one thing important to remember is that life in the ancient world was lived in public. Unlike our modern lifestyle, where most of what we do happens behind closed doors, first century life was much different. You'll see a crude drawing of a floor plan up here on the screen, but in a typical first century Galilean home, the main rooms were actually built around an open courtyard. And that room was sort of the space. It was the heart of the household where meals were served, guests were welcome, and everyday life unfolded. And unlike most of our homes today where gatherings are tucked behind closed doors, meals in the ancient world were very public. So if a well-known public figure or teacher was present, someone like Jesus, the doors of the home would be left wide open. And so neighbors and curious onlookers and even outsiders, they could wander into the courtyard to watch and to listen and observe the conversation from a distance. So there's Jesus at the dinner, reclining on a cushion on his left hand in typical first century fashion. So his left arm leaning, his legs would be stretched out behind him and enjoying the nice first century charcuterie board that we just talked about. And he's engaging in conversation, and everything is just moving along as expected. Until someone from the edges of the courtyard steps in. A little bit closer than expected. Too close, really. And suddenly, the atmosphere of this banquet, it starts to shift. And what was once comfortable now starts to feel a little awkward. In verse 37, it says, "A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume." So Luke tells us that a woman who's known for her sin approaches Jesus, and she's carrying an alabaster jar of perfume, but she's also carrying something less visible. She's bringing her shame and her pain and her brokenness. We don't know her name, but everyone at the dinner knew who she was because her reputation preceded her. Now, Luke doesn't give us specifics, but that label that we see in the scriptures, a sinful woman, combined with the uncomfortable reaction of the guests, suggests that this may have been a woman who had given herself over to men for money. Now, at the very least, she was someone whose choices had marked her in the eyes of society. And so her intrusion into this dinner, it causes a bit of a stir. Now remember, it wasn't unusual for outsiders to gather in the courtyard to watch a meal like this. It was sort of like the first century version of television and entertainment. This is what they came to see. But this woman doesn't just watch. She steps into the inner space. She crosses a line. She brings what the Pharisees would call uncleanness right into the house of a religious leader. And Luke makes us know exactly what kind of leader or this house it is. Because before we even learn of the host's name, Luke tells us 4 times that he's a Pharisee. And Pharisees were all about boundaries, clean and unclean. Insider, outsider, righteous, sinner. So when this woman enters the room, she's not just crashing a meal, she's violating everything these people believed about holiness and purity. And so her presence, it makes people uncomfortable at this banquet. But her actions, they make people squirm. Look at verse 38. As she stood behind him, at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. So she doesn't just stand there next to Jesus or behind him. She starts to weep. And we're not talking about the polite, quiet tears. These are the tears that are just falling freely like a faucet and just dripping and landing onto Jesus' feet. And then, in a move that would have shocked everyone in that courtyard, she lets down her hair. Now, in this culture, a woman's hair was her glory. And letting it down in public, especially in front of a man who wasn't her husband, was seen as indecent and scandalous. I mean, we're talking about something wildly inappropriate here, so much so that I don't even want to bring in a contemporary example, okay? It was just wildly inappropriate for a woman to let down her hair in front of a man who was not her husband. But she doesn't stop there. She uses her hair now to wipe the tears off of Jesus' feet, and she kisses them repeatedly and pours out the perfume, the one costly thing that she's brought with her. Now, to us, this might sound emotional, maybe even beautiful, but to the guests at that table, it was very unsettling, very uncomfortable, very awkward. And given her reputation and given these actions, they likely assumed the worst. They assumed that this sinful woman was attempting to seduce Jesus or manipulate him into something inappropriate. That's the level of discomfort that people are starting to feel at this meal. And yet, Jesus does nothing to stop her. There's no rebuke. There's no awkward withdrawal, no pulling away. He just sort of lets it happen. And everyone there is thinking the same thing. But Luke takes us into the mind of one person in particular. He takes us into the mind of Simon, the host. Let's look at verse 39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Simon's thoughts, they quietly reveal this misunderstanding, not only of this woman, but also of Jesus. His judgment is prideful, it's very harsh, and his heart becomes exposed. In his mind, this woman's sin makes her unworthy to be in the presence of a teacher like Jesus. For Simon, her past is what defines her, and he doubts Jesus' discernment for even allowing her to come near. So for Simon, Jesus almost seems naive, maybe even a fraud, because he doesn't stop her. He doesn't seem to know what kind of woman this is. Then Jesus says something that instantly shifts the atmosphere. You know what he says? In verse 40, he says, "Simon, I have something to tell you." See that shift? No, you don't, because that doesn't seem like much to us, right? But this was a phrase that was loaded with meaning in a Middle Eastern context. It's sort of like this warning that a hard truth is coming. So in today's terms, it might be something like if someone came up to you and said, "Hey, I'm going to be real with you right now." Or if someone says, "Hey, it's time for a reality check." You know at that moment a hard truth is coming. Whenever my wife wants to tell me a hard truth is coming, she'll say to me, "Hey, I'm very neutral right now." And immediately, like all those feelings, they like, okay, she's going to tell me something. What did I do wrong? Okay, how did I mess up? Like, I know a hard truth is coming, and I prepare myself. This is sort of what Jesus does when he says to Simon, "I have something to tell you." It doesn't seem like anything big, but again, in this context, this was shifting the atmosphere. It was raising the tension of the courtroom. Because by saying this, Jesus takes a very subtle but very clear position of authority over Simon. as if he's about to school him right there at the banquet. Simon says, "Tell me, teacher, what do you have to say?" And then Jesus shares a very simple yet powerful parable. A parable, very simply, is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And this is what he says in verse 41. It says, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. So the point of this parable is actually very plain and simple. So you have 2 people who owe money to a moneylender. One owes 500 denarii. It's hard to really calculate the exact amount of 500 denarii because it's not a unit of monetary value. It's a day's work of wages for an average day laborer. So it's roughly a little over a year's work for a day laborer. So in our context, that would be anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000. It's a lot of money. The other person owes just 50 denarii. So that would be about 2 months of work for a day laborer, somewhere around $5,000 to $7,500, somewhere in that vicinity. But we can see sort of the difference there. Now, in that culture, debt was a very, very serious thing because if you were unable to repay a debt, that would mean you either go to a debtor's prison or you go into slavery. It's a big deal. Having a debt canceled would have been a huge relief for anyone. And anyone that was forgiven a very large debt, like the one with the 500 denarii, they would naturally feel this overwhelming sense of gratitude. I mean, imagine if you lost your job today or this week and you couldn't pay back your school loans. Or what if you couldn't repay or make your mortgage payments? If that happened, maybe you become delinquent on your loans. Maybe your wages will be garnished. You might lose your home. Your credit score will drop. But you know what? If that ever happens, you know what won't happen? We won't go to jail, right? So it's not that bad, okay? Now imagine how you would feel if someone paid off your loans or made your mortgage payments for you for a year. I mean, you would be overjoyed at something like that. And we're not even avoiding prison at that point. So imagine the gratitude and the overwhelming sense of love that a person would feel in this situation. And so the parable's point is very straightforward. The person that's forgiven more is likely to love more in return, and that's what Simon says. And his reluctant answer to Jesus' question, it's correct, and Jesus acknowledges that. But Jesus is making a bigger connection here, saying that the cancellation of debt in this parable is exactly the same as the forgiveness of sins. And in the story, God is the gracious moneylender. The woman is the debtor with the larger debt, and Simon, who is sort of this self-righteous host, he's also in debt, but maybe he doesn't recognize that, or it's a smaller debt in his own eyes. Yet the parable challenges Simon's quiet assumption that he's somehow better than this woman. So Jesus forces Simon to recognize that he also owes a debt that only forgiveness can erase. And just in case Simon doesn't get it, just in case he misses the message, Jesus applies it directly to him in this scene here, in verse 44. It says, "Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, 'Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." So in this culture, it was customary for a host to provide water so that guests' feet could be washed. It was a gesture of hospitality and respect. Students would greet teachers with a kiss on the hand, but if they were equals, they might exchange a kiss on the cheek. Oil would always be offered so that people could refresh their face. Now, I'm sure that most of us here have played host at least one time in our life. Last week, my friend Hugo, he was in town and stayed with our family for a couple of nights. And I made sure to provide some fresh linens for him. We stocked our fridge with some of his favorite drinks, and I provided some toiletries for him just in case. He had flown in from Colorado early in the morning, and he went straight to help his in-laws move that morning. This was a day where it was like 100 degrees, so it was a pretty warm day for him. And when he got to our place, I figured that he'd want to take a shower and to freshen up. And so he goes in the shower, and then afterwards he says, "Hey, Danny, you might want to wash the hand towel in your bathroom." And I said, "Well, why? Why would I want to do that?" So, "Well, I didn't have a towel, and I saw the hand towel, and I thought it was clean enough." And I thought, not anymore. But you see, it wasn't because I didn't provide Hugo with a towel. I actually did. He just didn't take it with him into the bathroom, okay? Because even me can be somewhat hospitable and know the basic rules of hospitality. Simon, though, he was something else. As a Pharisee, he might have been a holy man, but he also had some serious holes in his hospitality game because he didn't do any of the customary things that a host should do in this situation. But the woman, Jesus says, she went far beyond the customs. She went far beyond the norms. She washed Jesus' feet with her tears. She wiped his feet dry with her hair and kissed them repeatedly. This is an act of humility and an act of sheer devotion. She anointed his feet with costly perfume. Remember, perfume, the oils would have been for the head because it was very costly. And so by going to the feet, like, you don't really need it there. It's a show of extravagance, overwhelming gratitude and love. Her actions were a heartfelt response to the forgiveness that she had received from Jesus. Now, some scholars will tell you that this woman probably had some previous interaction or encounter with Jesus where she was forgiven of her sins. It's not recorded here in the Gospel of Luke, but they suggest that she probably had this encounter with Jesus. She repented and she experienced this depth of forgiveness. And that would explain her appearance here at this dinner and her overwhelming gratitude. And so her tears were not tears of guilt or shame. They weren't tears of remorse for her sins. Rather, they were a recognition of the forgiveness that she had received from Jesus previously and now wanted to come back and to show her love for Jesus. Because she knew that she was forgiven. But Simon, and likely many of the others at that dinner party, did not see it that way. And Jesus needed to make this clear for everyone. And that brings us to this final moment here where we see the verdict. The woman has been forgiven. Jesus made that clear, and she continues to be forgiven even now. Jesus didn't ignore her troubled past. He actually acknowledged it. But more importantly, he recognized her present reality, that she is saved, that she's forgiven, and that she's made new. Look at verse 48. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Jesus gave this woman a clean slate, but the people around her had not. She still carried the weight of her past reputation. And that's why Jesus emphasizes twice that she has now been forgiven. Those words actually weren't for the woman. They were meant for Simon and for everybody else at the dinner party to hear. Because Jesus wanted them to see her not as a sinner, defined by her past, but rather as a person who has been restored by the grace and forgiveness of Jesus. And she's been renewed spiritually. But Jesus also wanted her to be restored socially as well. Now, this story, it ends without a real clear resolution. Luke doesn't tell us what Simon does next. Doesn't even tell us what Simon thought after this conversation. And in that silence, the story invites us, the readers, to reflect and to decide how we will respond to the point of this story. And what's the point? The point of the story is that those who recognize their need for forgiveness and have received it through faith in Jesus will respond with an overwhelming, extravagant, deep love for him. In other words, when people see themselves as sinners in need of God's grace and trust that Jesus has truly forgiven them, their faith naturally flows into these acts of deep love. So here's how I would like you to remember it in a very simple way this morning. And it's this: when grace sinks in, love pours out. When grace sinks in, love pours out. When the overwhelming grace of God settles into our hearts and into our minds, love cannot help but flow freely in our lives. So as we close this morning, here are 3 ways that we can live out this truth. Number 1, for some of us, we need to recognize our need for forgiveness. Like the woman who returned to Jesus, we need to recognize that we fall short of God's holy standard. This is something that Simon failed to do. He looked at the woman and he saw a big sinner, but he didn't even see himself as even a little sinner. Simon assumed that the opposite of sin was virtue. From his perspective as a Pharisee, he radiated virtue while the woman reeked of sin. But Soren Kierkegaard, he's a 19th century theologian, made a helpful observation that the opposite of sin isn't virtue, it's faith. Faith that says, I cannot fix myself. I need the help and the forgiveness of a Savior. There's no amount of virtuous behavior that any of us can do that can clean us up. Only faith in what Jesus did on the cross can do that. So we need to recognize our need for forgiveness on a daily basis. A second thing that we can challenge ourselves with is to refuse to judge others like Simon did. Jesus shows us through the woman's story that no one is too far gone for the grace of God. And that challenges us not to write people off. There is no hole that is too deep and too far from God's compassionate reach. You know, oftentimes when I engage in conversations with people, they eventually find out that I'm a pastor in ministry. And then immediately I can see the wheels turning of all the things that they said in that conversation. And they will start profusely apologizing for using curse words and all of those things. They'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. I just let them know that's okay. That's all right. They don't have to alter their behavior just for me. And see, the thing is, oftentimes we try to get people to change before they meet Jesus. But grace works the other way around. Grace comes first, change follows. So instead of judging, let's meet people where they are, believing that God can do in their lives what he's done in ours. We want to recognize our need for forgiveness, refuse to judge others like Simon. And thirdly, a challenge is to respond to forgiveness with love. Jesus said, "Those who are forgiven much love much." But here's the truth. It's not that God's forgiveness is ever small. It's that sometimes our awareness of how much we've been forgiven is small. Our recognition of that is small. And so whether your story looks more like Simon's or the woman's or maybe somewhere in between, know that you are forgiven. Every lie, every harsh word, every selfish thought, every outburst of anger towards our kids, everything that we've ever done wrong, all covered by the cross. And so how do we respond to that forgiveness? We pour out love like this woman did. And we pour that out in different ways. We don't all carry an alabaster jar around with us, okay? But we pour out our love for Jesus in so many different ways. We can do that by spending time with God in his word, in prayer, on a daily basis, just engaging with him. That is a way that we can pour out our love for him. We can pour out our love by serving his people, whatever that might look like here at church, in your workplace, in your community, just by serving the needs of others. That is a fantastic way to pour out love. We pour out love by inviting others into our lives, people who are still looking for hope, people who are in need of friendship, people in need of compassion and mercy. And by showing compassion at the table, just like Jesus did, that's what we can do to pour out love. So, friends, whatever the Spirit leads you to, may our response to Jesus always, always be an overwhelming, extravagant love. Because when grace sinks in, love pours out. Would you pray with me?